Hello, this is Alan Kozin welcoming you to another installment of Things We Said Today, our weekly Beatles podcast about all things to do with the Beatles, solo and group, past, present, and future if we can find out about it. And I'm joined by my three co-hosts, Ken Michaels, who you know is the host of the syndicated radio show Every Little Thing. Hello, Ken.
Hey, Alan. Hi, everybody.
And Steve Marinucci, whose work you know from the internet as the Beatles Examiner and the writer of several other Examiner columns. Hello, Steve.
Hello, Alan. Hello, everyone. Happy New Year.
Right. And Al Sussman, a longtime contributor and executive editor of Beatle Fan magazine. Hello, Al. How's it going?
Hi, Alan. Hello there, everybody.
And this week, we're going to begin with a bit of actual news just occurred today, as we record this anyway, which is the passing of Robert Stigwood, who had a brief but important Beatles connection in his partnership with Brian Epstein for a while. And apart from just a very significant musical career or music management career. Steve, do you want to give us some of the details about that?
Well, the connection with the Beatles is rather thin because he and Brian Epstein had talked about a partnership that never happened. But what he did do, there's two things. Number one, he was longtime manager for the Bee Gees, which were a big competition for the Beatles, and the Bee Gees actually did a number of Beatles songs on their own live. There are all sorts of, if you look on YouTube, there are several instances where they sang Beatles songs. And in fact, I wrote a story about that a few years ago. And the other thing, and I know this is going to probably start a debate among you guys, but he was also responsible for the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band movie, which a lot of people can't stand. I'm not one of those people. I actually thought parts of Sgt. Pepper were pretty good musically. The story of the movie is horrible, but the music in the movie is actually pretty good, and they do. And of course, he had all that. He had all those Beatle connections. Billy Preston was in it. George Martin, I believe, produced that album. Did he not? Mm-hmm. There were all sorts of, Beatle connections to that movie, and the movie got
Peter Frampton.
Peter Frampton was in it, of course.
Steve Martin.
Yeah. I mean, there a lot of it's gotten a lot of critical bashing. I don't honestly think it's that bad. The music, I think, is actually.
So it's a good soundtrack album and a horrible movie, is basically what you're saying.
Yeah. Right.
Steve, didn't Stigwood and Brian work together for most of a year at some point on presentations? Am I wrong about that?
I was looking, doing some looking around, and what I saw said no, that they had done some, that they had considered around the time that Brian died of getting together, and it never happened. Let me see.
Well, actually, in January of '67, they did enter a kind of a tenuous partnership of NEMS Enterprises and Stigwood's group at that point, and it lasted for about 9 months until Brian died.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, when and in fact there was talk of possibly of Brian, because at that point he was having some personal problems and et cetera, and there was talk that Brian might even let Stigwood take over the management of the group, which the group absolutely was 100% totally against.
Mm-hmm.
But then after Brian died, and the Epstein family, installed Clive, Brian's brother, as the head of NEMS, that was that pretty much sealed Stigwood's doom as far as involvement with NEMS, and he just moved on and formed his the Robert Stigwood organization, RSO, which became his big production management group.
Right.
But
Saturday Night Fever and
right,
all that stuff.
Yeah, but
Grease,
right. But
Mm-hmm.
there was at least a semi-official kind of merger that went on for about 9 months there in '67.
Okay.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't know that it wasn't really, in terms of Beatle history, it wasn't really that significant, though. I really don't think. I mean,
Well, it did bring, for instance, the Bee Gees and Cream into the NEMS family for those few months, and in fact, it was through the connections with Murray the K that the Bee Gees and Cream and the Who as well ended up being in one of the last of those Murray the K multi-act, multi-day shows that he did at various theaters. They used to do them at the Brooklyn Fox Theater, and I think this one was at the RKO Theater in Manhattan in the spring of '67, and and that was basically through the connections that Murray had with Brian and NEMS, and by extension Stigwood.
mm-hmm.
Also, didn't Stigwood pretty much kind of guide or manage Eric Clapton from, say,
Yes.
Cream through all the different bands and Blind Faith and Derek and the Dominoes and the solo career and all that? So he played a big part with Eric's
absolutely
career.
Did.
And then he also played a big part in musicals, too. And as we had just mentioned, Andrew Lloyd Webber, musicals like Jesus Christ Superstar and Evita, I think he worked on, too.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, he had a very impressive career, no doubt about it. And just thinking about all the records on RSO, it's he's left behind a lot, a great legacy right there.
This link I'm looking at here says he was also involved with John, Paul, George, Ringo, and Bert.
Right. Which was a Broadway show, or off, really off Broadway, barely off Broadway show that was done at the Beacon, if I remember correctly, in '74, which kind of set the template for the Sgt. Pepper movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was that didn't last very long.
No, but although John Lennon actually did a little bit of promotion for that in I think it was October of '74, during the period when he was promoting Walls and Bridges.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
Okay. So, farewell, Robert Stigwood. In discussing what would be the main part of the show this week, we were kicking around the idea of choosing a solo album, which was Ken's idea, and then he kicked that into my court, and I had to pick the solo album. And so, so I chose George's Gone Troppo, just because I think it is one of those great underrated Beatles solo albums, which I guess you could say for a lot of George's and Ringo's albums. You could probably say it for a lot of Paul's albums too. But no one ever talks about Gone Troppo. I don't know that anyone bought it, I mean, I came a little bit late to a lot of the solo stuff. I was mainly a group guy, and it was really only when I had paid some attention to the early part of George's career. I went to the concert for Bangladesh, and then just sort of tuned out for a bit and caught up a bit later in the 80s. And as I was sort of going around picking up the various things that I missed, Gone Troppo, I mean, I don't remember hearing all that much about it when it was out. It pretty much disappeared. And I bought it, took it home, played it, and I thought, this is a really nice album. There is some great stuff on it, and all told, it's a very pleasant listen. And it's George. It was basically almost the last we heard from George until Cloud Nine. So there was like a 5-year gap. There were some other things. There was the I Don't Want to Do It from Porky's Revenge, and Blue Suede Shoes.
The Carl Perkins.
Yeah. Right. And a Princess Trust appearance, but he was really laying low during that period. So Con Troppo was the impression I got. I could be wrong. You guys feel free to correct me, which I know you will. My feeling about that was sort of as if he just sort of threw up his hands in disgust and said, "Okay, why should I keep putting these things out?" But it's really a lovely album, and I thought maybe we'll go around and start with Steve. I'm not saying that we all necessarily agree that it's a lovely album, so I'm sure we'll get some diversity of opinion here.
Yes, you will, because
I had a feeling.
Dude, oh God, Con Troppo is just one of those albums that I never really. I mean, I love George. George's albums have always been very special to me, but Con Troppo is one of the few Beatles. Well, is one of his albums that I just never got into. I just never thought it was. It just never did much for me. I do like "Wake Up My Love," and That's the Way It Goes. The first few songs I really like. Con Troppo sounds. The title song itself just sounds kind of. Oh gosh, I don't know how to put it. It just sounds like he's basically. You were talking about throwing up your hands, Alan. It's like he was just kind of going, well, whatever goes, and so I did, Mystical One I do like. In fact, on the remastered CD, there's an outtake that's actually pretty nice. But Con Troppo just is not a grabber as far as I'm concerned. It's not one of my favorite George albums. I don't know what to. The songs just didn't hook me that much. What can I say?
Okay. The looked for diversity of opinion has turned up right at the start, as I suspected it might.
Oh, thank you.
Ken?
Now to have the exact opposite opinion of Steve.
No,
I think that Con Troppo to me is one of the most underrated of George's albums. And like you were saying, Alan, there's a lot of underrated solo Beatle albums, actually from all 4 Beatles. But Con Troppo, I think, is, like you said, a very pleasant listen. I happen to like all the songs on there. I think they're very catchy. And the ones that aren't as catchy take a while to grow on you, but when they do, they really hook you in, at least for me anyway. Sometimes I like to think of this album as being similar to the George Harrison album of 1979, in that it's a very laid-back album. You get the feeling that George is in Hawaii or, on a tropical island, and he's relaxing, and these are the songs that came out of him. The reason why, radio was gradually abandoning George's music. I mean, Somewhere in England, the previous album, despite the fact that it had a number 2 hit with All Those Years Ago, and that being a huge hit because it was a tribute to John, as well as being a great song to me, it still didn't do that well as an album. It only went to number 11 on the charts. And I think that George was really disgusted with the music industry at the time, and this was the last of his albums to fulfill a contractual obligation, and he really didn't want to do any promotion behind it. And in fact, he didn't do any. And unless you were a reader of, say, Beatle Fan magazine, you wouldn't have known that this album had even come out. I worked at a record store at the time, and I was surprised when I saw it being put on the shelves. I didn't even know that it was about to be released. So George did nothing to promote it, and still to this day, because I always reference George's book, I Me Mine, to find out information about the songs that he wrote. That book only took you through 1979. You don't know too much about these songs as far as, why George wrote them. But the songs are really strong. And In particular, I love Mystical One.
Mm-hmm.
I really think that it's a very commercial song, and the production on that song, as well as the whole album, is just wonderful. I love the use of the mandolin, in particular, on Mystical One, which is played by Joe Brown, who's been a longtime friend of George's, who lived close by and was a British star from the early '60s on up. The Beatles covered A Picture of You, one of his songs that was a hit over there.
Mm-hmm.
But the songs one by one are very strong. They're all produced extremely well. That's one thing about George's albums as a solo artist. I think they're all produced so well. And in particular, once it was on his own label, Dark Horse, I think the production on his albums were much crisper, and you could actually hear the instrumentation much more defined. And the playing on here, he always has great musicians.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it on all of his albums, and they really shine on all of his albums, and in particular because I love the production. I love the production on this album. You really hear some of the great playing throughout. In particular, Henry Spinetti,
Right.
who's the younger brother of Victor Spinetti, does great drumming throughout this album. Just listen to the beginning of the drums on That's the Way It Goes, the full sound of that.
And Ray Cooper's
I love
on
that.
here, and Herbie Flowers, the bassist.
Right.
Billy Preston on Circles. Jim Keltner.
Oh, yeah.
There's
Right.
He's assembled a really good bunch of people here, as you say. I think,
Yeah.
you mentioned Mystical One, and, the other striking thing about that, you talked about the production, is that, you look at the first verse, they say, I'm not what I used to be, all the same, I'm happier than a willow tree. It seems a little bit like he's also responding to, the way people are ignoring him in a way,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, he's content with who he is. And one of the things that I kind of noticed, and I've said this before in various shows, I think at the very beginning of George's solo career, I think it mattered a lot to him whether or not his music sold well and that he was recognized. And I think once he had that initial success with All Things Must Pass and then the Concert for Bangladesh, and even, Living in the Material World was a #1 album, he still had top 10 albums through Extra Texture. I think he didn't feel as much of a need to prove himself. So he started to put out music that pleased himself first, more so than whether or not it sold, which is not to say that he didn't put out commercial music. Like 33 1/3 we've talked about has some really catchy songs on there like Crackerbox Palace and this song. And he had a great sense of humor when he made that album. But gradually, as time went on, he was putting out music that I think was made to please himself first, more so than whether or not it sold. Not that he didn't care at all whether it sold or not, but I think he was pretty disgusted with the music industry and the changes that were happening in the early 80s. And I don't know if it really upset him that Somewhere in England didn't do as well as it did. We also know that initially with Somewhere in England, he had 4 different songs that he wanted in the album that Warner Brothers rejected. I'm sure that didn't make him very happy.
No.
So, for all these reasons, George did nothing to promote this album. And it's a shame because song for song, I really think it's a solid album. And in particular, I like when you hear something different from an artist. Baby Don't Run Away is a song that has stood out for me in a way because you have this really low harmony vocal, which apparently based on the credits on the album was Billy Preston. And he's also got this woman on there, Rodina Sloan, who does the female vocal. And I like the sound of George singing with a female, which you don't hear all that often.
Sure.
I mean, it happened later on with Shanghai Surprise when George sang that with Vicki Brown. But I really like that approach. And, Dream Away, a lot of people thought that had commercial appeal. It first appeared in Time Bandits. And it was really, that's a catchy song right there.
Yeah.
And Circles has emerged for me as one of my all-time favorite George Harrison songs. And we all know that it originated during the White Album, and they made a demo for that. And, it's a very philosophical song with very powerful lyrics in there. It's all about the changes in life, that everything goes in circles. And, certain lines like, dislike someone who will not bend, later they may become your best friend. I think we've all gone through experiences like that. And yet, as we've said here on this show, the Beatles back in the days, when they were very young in the group, they put out songs. They wrote songs that were so mature for their age, like, Paul writing Yesterday or John writing In My Life or George writing Within You Without You at the age of, what was that, 23
Yeah.
or 24. Here's somebody writing Circles, and it was 1968, so George was 25, writing lyrics like this. How does he know all this about life? All these the philosophical words that are in that song. I love Circles, and I love the use of the slide guitar, which he's always been great at. Some really nice slide guitar work in that song, and especially on Mystical One, and That's the Way It Goes. I love the light feel of Con Troppo. I love the instrumental of Grease, although I wish I knew all the words that he sang in the song, and it was never in the liner notes, and you can't find it anywhere. Although I've never seen the songbook, I should admit, for Con Troppo. But Unknown Delight is a gorgeous song, great ballad. In fact, the guitar solo in the middle is very much like his guitar solo in Something. And I've often wondered if that song was about Danny Harrison, because it kind of, if you listen to the lyrics, kind of makes you think it might be about him, So, yeah, I just think song for song, it's a really good album. And unfortunately, like I said, George did nothing to promote it. And the fact that the record company wasn't really promoting him and radio wasn't really welcoming him all that much. And that's why it got ignored and is so completely overlooked in his career.
Yeah, it was pretty much out of step with what the commercial record industry was doing. It's got George's accent all over it, his musical accent, the slide guitar, the kind of tunes he wrote. And also, I think he said this specifically about Cloud Nine, but it applies to this too. It's an album of real songs by real people played on real instruments, and that was different from what was going on. So, Al?
Right.
Your comments?
It's funny that Ken mentioned Somewhere in England and Beatle fan, as a matter of fact. And Alan, you might remember this because you were involved with the magazine in those early years. But I did a review of Somewhere in England, an album which I did not like at the time and have never really warmed up to all that much. But I did a pretty negative review, and that got me in a lot of trouble with the Harrison fandom and sort of Beatle fandom in general, because this was at a time when I think fans had not yet gotten used to negative reviews in Beatles publications. So got a lot of flack about that. And so I was really not particularly looking forward to this album, to Con Troppo. So when I got it and listened to it, I was pleasantly surprised. It was just a lovely little, just delightful album. Not nearly as erratic as Somewhere in England, and also not nearly as frankly as crabby as some of the songs like Blood from a Clone had been on Somewhere in England. Although, to be fair, Blood from a Clone has been proven to be a lot more accurate than I think a lot of us gave George credit for at the time. But Con Troppo was, as I said, much more positive. The songs that I particularly liked were there were 3 tracks that are kind of very much vocal group kind of oriented. That's the Way It Goes is one of those. Baby Don't Run Away, which Ken was just speaking of. There's another one where George's vocal itself is mixed down in the mix, so he's really more part of a group. And particularly, I Really Love You, which was the biggest surprise on the album to me, because back when I was about 11 years old and was just starting to listen to rock and roll in the spring of 1961, I remember a record by a group called the Stereos called I Really Love You that I remember hearing on the radio in New York. It was never a hit. It may have had some success in New York, but I figured I was the only person in the world that knew this song. And here George Harrison records it on this album with basically the same, recreating in effect the Stereos record, and doing it very successfully. And it's just a totally charming album, I found. Circles was one of those songs that I think again that we tended to not understand at the time, and of course now in retrospect it has a lot more, as Ken was saying, a great deal of wisdom for somebody who was at the time it was released, or not at the time it was released, at the time he wrote it, was basically 25 years old. And that kind of wisdom is pretty remarkable, and it carries, of course, now a poignance that was, obviously totally unintended. But overall, it's just it's a mystical one. Is another fine track. Wake Up, My Love. The album opener is very accessible. It's just as Ken was saying, it's unfortunate that George did no promotion for it whatsoever, and that radio perhaps burned from the experience of somewhere in England. Didn't really, even FM radio didn't really warm to that album, didn't really warm to Con Troppo in the way that that it had with previous albums of George's, and in fact, it didn't even make the national in America. It didn't even make Billboard's top 100 albums. So
no, it did.
Right.
It did not. 108 actually.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So it's a very I feel it's a very underrated album, and it's one of those to coin a phrase, unknown delights in the in the Harrison catalog.
Yeah.
Yeah. Al, you mentioned I Really Love You, which to me is also different in the sense that George's vocals, he sings in a higher register and he harmonizes with everybody, but he's not really so much the lead vocalist in the song. Right. And in fact, the verses of the song come from a singer named Bobby King.
Yes.
Who was really like an R&B and gospel singer. And I know that he did a lot of work with Ry Cooder, which George is a big fan of Ry Cooder, so maybe that's how he entered the picture.
So, yeah.
But yeah, so it's very different in that regard. It's not like it's a George Harrison song where he's the main lead vocalist. Right. It's very different in that regard. So.
And much the same with Baby Don't Run Away, where even though he is the lead vocalist, his vocal is much closer to the backup singers than way above it.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear that low vocal from Billy Preston throughout that song. I thought that was really unique.
Very much so.
I just wanted to read this line from Unknown Delight if I could, because when I hear this, I immediately think of Danny. It says, a treasure of the world, a child watching it grow, and with all the love will bring unknown delight. So when I hear those words, darkest deep brown eyes I've seen, angel came into my dream. It could be about him. Don't know. We'll have to ask Danny someday.
I did see somewhere in doing research over the weekend while I was getting reacquainted with the album that I believe that song is about Danny, who had been born. Unfortunately, I don't have his birth date right at hand, but
I know it.
Okay.
It's August 1st, 1978.
Oh, okay. So depending on when it was written, it's very possible that it was about Danny.
Mm-hmm.
Danny's birthday is always easy for me to remember because it's the same date as the concert for Bangladesh.
Ah,
Only 7 years later.
Right.
So, yeah.
I think you mentioned "I Really Love You," and it's kind of a quirky little aside on the album, and it sort of calls to mind the fact that George's covers, which he has on almost every album, are a little bit unusual for a rock star. He's got True Love, Cole Porter, on Somewhere in England. There are a couple of Hoagie Carmichael songs. Then there's this, Cloud Nine, Got My Mind Set on You, which was, I don't think a lot of people knew that song, but if I'm not incorrect, I think, isn't there footage of in the Maisles brothers films of him buying or carrying around the James Ray album?
Yeah.
And even at the very end, there's, let's see, what was it on
Brainwashed?
On Brainwashed, yeah, there was I think it was another Hoagie Carmichael song, wasn't it?
No, it was Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea.
Right.
Which was was it Harold Arlen, I think, maybe, who wrote that? Right. Cab Calloway had a hit with it.
Yes, right. Harold Arlen, Ted Koehler.
Right.
Looking at the credits here. So, I think it's another of the many underrated things about George Harrison. His choice of covers for his albums is really kind of interesting. And I think...
And not only that, but we've talked about when we discussed Dark Horse, the album, but Bye Bye Love, which is by far and away a classic rock song from the 50s, he did a completely different spin on it.
Right.
So,
Right. The one thing that's a puzzle to me about this album are the liner notes about cement mixing. Anyone have any idea what that is about?
No.
No?
Just a joke?
Probably.
I guess.
Okay. So.
What's
he
that?
was a gardener.
That's true.
Yeah. So I imagine he knew how to mix cement too.
Well, maybe it's in the spirit of keep it in a cool, dry place.
Yeah.
Maybe
dealing with what's around. But yeah, this is spun out quite long. This liner note here. This album has been a cement mix, it says. So, anything else to say about Gun Troppo?
Well, actually, the title itself is supposed to be an Australian expression, which means gone crazy or gone mad. So, but whenever I hear that song, I immediately think of Hawaii or a tropical island and palm trees.
Sure.
It immediately evokes that. So, it does something very successfully there in the lyrics and just the feel of the song. But, more and more, I'm kind of like, equating it a little bit with the George Harrison album, in that it is, like you said, very pleasant, very charming, very laid back, very easygoing. It's like hang out with George in his rocking chair, playing some either acoustic guitar, slide guitar. It's just a very relaxing and very enjoyable album.
Absolutely. So I guess one of the services that we can perform in this podcast is sort of recalling some things that maybe people either have forgotten about or in a lot of cases probably have never even bothered listening to. So go out and pick up Gon Troppo, and splendid time is guaranteed for all. Except for Steve. Steve doesn't like it much, but nevertheless. So we also thought we would talk this week about the lines of convergence and divergence, I guess, between the Beatles' career and Elvis, because early January is Elvis's birthday. Is it like 81st birthday? Something?
Yep.
Yep.
And in fact, there's also Frank Sinatra's birthday centenary was quite recently too. And in a certain way, the three of them have a lot in common and an awful lot not in common. So whose idea was the Elvis thing? That's who we should start with. Steve?
Steve.
I think it was mine. And what's interesting about Elvis and the Beatles was when you compare the atmospheres when the two of them became famous. Obviously, in the 50s, when Elvis was a rising star, I think there was a lot more scorn, and I think Elvis was looked down upon a lot harsher than the Beatles were. Even though the Beatles' acceptance did not come easy, I think Elvis kind of paved the way for that a little bit and made and at least helped the Beatles rise to success a little bit. But what's interesting is the differences between the two. Elvis was this real hard, sexy guy, where the Beatles were after they had come out of the cavern and they had gone to Suits, they were very, Brian wanted them to have family appeal, and they did. And there was that kind of difference. And the fact that they actually crossed paths, I actually saw something online that claimed that they never met, and I kind of laughed when I saw that. Even though there's been pictures and everything like that, even though there's been no tapes, but the fact that they crossed paths in more than one instance. When Elvis sent the cable to Ed Sullivan the night that they appeared on the Ed Sullivan show, and then they met in Bel Air in Hollywood, and then supposedly, according to various rumors, Elvis, when he met President Nixon, wanted to take down the Beatles because he thought they were influencing drug culture, which is hilarious.
Really. Elvis should talk.
Yeah. That whole story anyway is just kind of silly, but I think there was a healthy respect between the Beatles. At least respected him. Because John Lennon has said many times that Elvis, was a big influence on him. So, there was respect at least from one side and probably from the other. But
do you think that Elvis really had anything to do with that telegram to the Sullivan Show? I always assumed that was just Colonel Parker.
Yeah.
I'm managerial.
I'm sure it was. I'm sure that was that was kind of a showbizy thing. And yeah, I really doubt that. He may have, whether or not he told Elvis about it. We've all heard the sleazy stories about Colonel Parker anyway, so it's hard to say what. But I would agree that it's probably unlikely that Elvis had a whole lot to do with that telegram, if anything at all.
Mm.
And I think the Beatles' respect for Elvis went only to a point. John Lennon, in one of the interviews he gave in 1980 when he sort of reemerged, said, everyone kept asking me what I thought about Elvis dying. Elvis died when he went into the army. That's what I thought about Elvis dying. So we're talking about 1956, right?
Yeah, but that was that's a typical
58.
That's
58.
58.
That's a typical Lennon comment. You have to kind of. I honestly. I think he appreciated Elvis's music.
Well, yeah, but there's also an appearance they did on Jukebox Jury very early, 63, 64, where they got one of Elvis's records and really panned it.
Mm-hmm. But then again, John sang with Chuck Berry on the Mike Douglas show, and that's the same era.
That's Chuck Berry.
Right,
Chuck
but
Berry.
Right.
right, but I'm saying it's the same. The music of that era, it's the music he grew up with, and I think he had a healthy respect for that music, even though he may have dissed Elvis on that show, and they may have there may have been instances, but I really think that they had a respect for their roots. Look at the fact that they played, they did some of that stuff during the Let It Be sessions.
What they really revered was the pre-army Elvis. Was
right.
Elvis.
Oh,
The Rock. Elvis the Rocker.
Elvis
right.
the Rocker.
And
they were vocally unhappy about the way his career developed during the 60s. where making all of these crummy movies and with the quality of his records decreasing with great rapidity as we get into 1963 and 64 and 65, et cetera. And so that actually they were echoing the sentiments of a lot of his sort of the fans of the 50s generation, who, because let's face it, John said that, in another interview, said nothing mattered really until Elvis.
Right.
Right.
And Paul McCartney was even more of a disciple of Elvis than John was.
And it's funny if you think about the fact that in the middle of when the Beatles, in '68, when the Beatles were doing like the White Album and stuff like that, Elvis went back to leather and did his comeback special in Burbank. So.
Right. So.
Well, sometimes I think we have a tendency to dismiss what John said because he changed his mind so much. But at the same time, you can also make the point that I think even though he changed his mind a lot, he kind of did feel the way he did in the moment. So there has to be some weight put to that. And Paul McCartney has said similar words about, liking Elvis the best before he went into the Army.
Right.
So whenever they did cover Elvis, it usually was the early stuff, although Paul did cover It's Now or Never during the Russian album sessions. But that was their own personal taste. So, and I think Elvis must have liked the Beatles, otherwise he wouldn't have covered Beatles music and performed it live.
Right.
So,
which was mainly,
you can't just say across.
Mainly Something in Yesterday, right? I mean, I'm not sure what more he did.
Hey
Jude, yeah, that's true. There might have been a Lady Madonna in there. Not sure. It's funny. I have virtually everything Elvis did, including all of those Follow That Dream series where they put out all the outtakes of albums, and I'm partly fascinated by it, and partly it's I understand what John objected to totally. I mean, there is an awful lot of junk in the Elvis catalog. And I listen to it sometimes with a kind of weird, morbid fascination. And the same here, I'll say something that's bound to be widely unpopular with Elvis and also Frank Sinatra, who, I also love a lot of Frank Sinatra's work, and I love a lot of Elvis's work. I mean, apart from the stuff I just mentioned, they were incredible singers. But the difference for me between Elvis and Frank Sinatra and the Beatles are that Elvis and Frank Sinatra were just incredibly overdeveloped larynxes. And the Beatles were a group of musicians who wrote incredible music, and those two didn't. And the writing of incredible music, to me, puts them several drawers higher in the sort of musical pantheon than Elvis and Frank Sinatra, however great they may have been as interpreters.
I would say Elvis, yes, but I think Sinatra had a natural voice. I disagree with you on Sinatra, including Sinatra in that group, because I think his voice is a lot more natural. At least I think Elvis was much more embellished, if you want to use that, if you want to make that comparison. But by the way, I looked up online, and Elvis also did Get Back live. So, and I actually have the list here of songs that Elvis songs covered by the Beatles and songs they both did together. You guys want to hear them?
Sure.
Okay. The Elvis songs covered by the Beatles are "That's All Right, Mama." You could probably, I'm sure our listeners already have these down. "I Got a Woman," "I'm Gonna Sit Right Down and Cry Over You," "I Forgot to Remember to Forget." Okay. And the ones they both did together, "Long Tall Sally," "Memphis," "Too Much Monkey Business," and "Johnny Be Good."
Okay, but some of those weren't primarily, Elvis known for as Elvis songs. I mean, "Long Tall Sally," you think of Little Richard.
Little Richard, and the other three are Chuck Berry songs.
Right.
It just happened that the Beatles and Elvis both recorded them, but so did everybody else.
Right.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about That's All Right Mama, I mean that's a very obvious Elvis song. So.
Oh, sure.
Okay. Yeah.
And then you've got all the solo recordings of Elvis music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Solo Beatles.
Right.
You've got, you're talking about Long Tall Sally. John performed Blue Suede Shoes, which do you think of it more as Carl Perkins or do you think of it more for Elvis?
I would say Carl Perkins myself, but that's me.
Okay. Paul covered All Shook Up.
Mm-hmm.
Ringo covered Don't Be Cruel.
Right.
What else?
Well, Paul did, although Elvis and Wanda Jackson each did Party, which Paul did on the Run Devil Run album, and also there's
I know one. Just Because.
right.
Mm-hmm.
Just Because on the Russian album was part of the Sun Sessions for Elvis.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and there is another on Run Devil Run. There's another Elvis cover that I'm blanking out on.
And there's also All My Trials too, which was.
Oh, right.
Well, All My Trials was part of, at least when the way Elvis did it, was part of the American trilogy that Mickey Newbury had put together. Because it's a PD song.
Paul did I Got Stung on.
That's
Right.
the one. Yes, I knew it was one of those that came out while he was in the Army.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the one.
And that was actually a really good version of I Got Stung too. So.
Right.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, I agree with Alan's comments, but there are still some differences between Frank Sinatra, Elvis, and the Beatles. I mean,
Sure.
Elvis was the biggest artist of the 50s, just like the Beatles were the biggest artists of the 60s. I think Elvis Presley, and I completely disagree with you on this, Steve, I think he was one of the greatest singers of all time. I really do. He's one of those few artists who I can listen to every day and never get tired of hearing his voice. He had such an incredible mass appeal, and one of the things that makes him unique, and we're living in a time when the term crossover artist doesn't mean anything like it used to, but he was one of the few artists out there who not only had hits on the pop charts, but it was also on the R&B charts, and he was also on the country charts. And then in addition to that, not only did he have one of these voices that was so flexible that, it fit very well on these formats, but he did gospel music. Mm-hmm. He did How Great Thou Art. He had one of the greatest voices ever.
Oh, I'm just saying that if you're talking about, Alan was making a point that in natural voices, the Beatles had it over Elvis and
I wasn't really saying that. I it's not really what I meant. Go ahead. What I was saying was that those guys are interpreters, just incredible interpreters, but really just interpreters. I know Elvis has some songwriting credits, and Sinatra may even have a couple here and there.
I think the Elvis songwriting credits may have been a little bit of Colonel Parker's doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, but the difference between the difference I was pointing out between the Beatles, Elvis, and Sinatra were that the Beatles wasn't really about their singing. It was about the fact that they were actually creative in a non-interpretive way. There are people who say that interpretation is creative, and in a way it certainly is. But there's a different level of creativity if you're sort of making a song from nothing than if you are taking someone's song and interpreting it.
I think you have to. I think after having watched the All or Nothing at All documentary recently, he was. I'm not trying to go full head here and trying to knock over what you said, but Sinatra and for example Nelson Riddle worked on those arrangements for the songs that Sinatra sang, and a lot of that recording studio stuff was Sinatra's doing. So I think there were differences because of the time, because of the eras. I think that's So I think I don't know. Maybe you can argue that was true for a lot of.
Let me put it in a different way.
Okay.
What is a more supreme creative act? Writing something or singing a great version of something?
All right.
By something, I'm George Harrison something, not just the word something.
Okay. All right. No, I
Well,
go ahead.
I think amongst all of us, we'll all agree that we think the Beatles were the best of them all. But I do think it is a very unique talent and an underrated talent to be a great interpreter as a singer and to have a style that is uniquely your own. And Frank Sinatra developed one. He was so great at phrasing. That's what made a lot of his music so different, is the way that he sang his song. You could sing a song great, but what he put into it, the emotion that he put into it. When other artists are trying to copy what you're doing, and just like a lot of people tried to copy Elvis and copy the Beatles, but with the Beatles, their influence goes far beyond just vocals. It's songwriting, it's production, it's all that. You've got that whole package. With Elvis, and really we're selling both Elvis and Frank Sinatra short, because to me, Frank Sinatra was also a really good actor. In addition to, he was a very good dancer as far as I'm concerned. Elvis Presley had the ability to act, but he was given formula movies for the most part. When there were those rare moments when he had a good acting role, like even Love Me Tender, he was good. But, King Creole or one of those movies, as opposed to all the other ones where basically, he gets the girl in the end kind of movie. Those were all the same. And there wasn't, it wasn't interesting. It was really made for the fans who would go and see anything that Elvis would do. But if he was given better roles, his career could have taken a completely different turn. But, I feel bad for the way that John and Paul, and I think George expressed it too, said that, Elvis was never the same after the Army, because I think that in some ways he also developed as an artist even more. Doing a lot of the late 60s, going into the 70s stuff, which I know a lot of people think is too Vegas-y for some people. But I love a lot of that music. I love the ballady stuff he does. In the Ghetto was an amazing song. The Wonder of You, Suspicious Minds, all that stuff. I don't think that just his great stuff was in the early part of his career.
The problem is that he wasted, and unfortunately a lot of this was mandated by Colonel Parker. Unfortunately Elvis wasn't, Elvis didn't do what in effect John Lennon did. The comment that John made to Brian in the studio one particular time, when Brian made some suggestions about, during a recording session, and John said something to the effect of, we'll handle the music, you handle the percentages. If Elvis had stood up to Colonel Parker in that way, his career might have taken a completely different direction. But unfortunately, he knuckled down to Parker's demands that he make these crummy movies and these awful soundtrack albums, and so he frittered away most of the 60s, and then finally after the 68 what's come to be known as the 68 comeback special, he did this wonderful album in Memphis, from Elvis in Memphis, then went into into making personal appearances again at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. But unfortunately, again, after about a year, by 1971, and of course a lot of this, the drug intake, all the pills and everything, and the increase in weight and all that was taking a toll. But by 71, he was already beginning to coast again, and spent much of the rest of his career, up until his death in 77, doing that, just coasting through, the white suit and thank you very much, and all that stuff. And so the problem is that the really significant material that he recorded is, unfortunately, besides the stuff that he did before he went into the Army and all the influence he had from those years, unfortunately, from what he turned out after his release from the Army, there's not that much that's really significant. Let's put it that way. And that's the biggest problem. Whereas, obviously the Beatles as a group, had a much, much shorter career. But, I mean, look at what they accomplished in 7 years.
Mm. Well, I don't know if I necessarily agree with what you had to say about Elvis's music there, because some of my favorite music of Elvis is late 60s going into the 70s,
Well, yeah,
despite his declining
that
health.
period from say 68 through 70 into like 71. Yeah, actually, there's that certainly is probably the best period of his post army years. But then by 71, he's starting to coast already.
In terms of his
it,
albums, you can take any one of those 50s albums, Elvis Presley, Elvis, Lovin' You, even Elvis's Christmas album,
Yeah.
King Creole. You can listen to those albums start to finish, and they're just great. And the later albums, you'll find a track here and there. Then you say that's this isn't bad. This is, if I were making an Elvis playlist, I might put this on it, but they're not consistent in that same way. Those early albums are great albums.
Exactly.
Great rock albums.
Yeah. Okay. Although so is the first album that he did after he came out of the Army, an album called Elvis is Back, which is basically, it's all blues and R&B. There are no singles from it, or at least no singles were released at the time. And it's great. But again, he, because Colonel Parker wanted him to become, more of an all-round entertainer, and recording It's Now or Never and Surrender, and they were big hits. And so, again, it was mandated that should be the kind of material he records.
Fortunately, the Beatles didn't go, the Beatles stuck, as somebody mentioned earlier, the Beatles stayed on course and I mean, can you imagine if the Beatles had gone that route? Oh God, the thought is just terrible.
Well, first, I love It's Now or Never. I love the early '60s stuff too. Little Sister is a great record. I love Surrender. I don't think that those were such horrible records.
Well, no, I'm not saying they were horrible, but he could have done so much more.
Mm-hmm.
He could have done, but unfortunately, because of the success, Blue Hawaii is really the film that really kind of set the template for almost the rest of the decade, because that was at that point the biggest moneymaker of his career. And from there on, Colonel Parker mandated, he said, this is the kind of movie that people want to see. So this is the kind of movie you're going to do. And so it was Girls, 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 and Follow That Dream, and Kissin' Cousins, and Harem Scarum, and Double Trouble, which is one of the worst movies ever made. It was, the one where he supposedly is in England, and it was completely made on a Hollywood, soundstage, and in fact, Norman Rosington is in the film.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but it is absolutely dreadful, and they just got worse and worse and worse until finally in '68, around the time of the Singer special, that he finally began to take some interest in the way his career was developing.
You didn't mention.
Well, I'm just saying in my case, I just want to say that I understand what you're all saying here, but I followed Elvis's singles mainly. So throughout the 70s, I loved just about everything he put out as a single, and not just through 71. So I'm not one of those people who automatically just look at the early period and say that that's it. He still put out some good singles, early 60s, late 60s. That mid 60s is when there really was a drought, I think. But, late 60s, If I Can Dream is another great song.
Absolutely.
And I love a lot of the, My Boy from 1973 was an amazing song for me. And, I liked Way Down and Moody Blue and those records. So the singles he put out in the 70s were very significant for me. I loved it. It wasn't this comparison between that and the 50s for me. I kind of embraced all of it, as far as his hits.
I like some of it too. I mean, I love the gospel stuff. I have the RCA collection with all the gospel stuff. I like his version of You Were Always in My Mind. I like that. And I actually don't mind. I know there's probably a lot of people that think the Las Vegas stuff is horrible, but I love that satellite recording where he does does the full blown with the jumpsuit and everything. I really enjoy that. I actually don't particularly care for the comeback special all that much. I do like
Really? Huh.
Well,
I do like the satellite stuff.
You're in the minority because
I know. Yeah, it seems like I'm in the minority here a lot, aren't I?
Yeah.
But no, I do like that. I mean, I have a fairly good Elvis collection. There was one, and I can't remember the title of it now. There was a bootleg that came out years ago on vinyl from the Memphis sessions that is absolutely wonderful. There was a whole series of vinyl bootlegs, and I cannot remember the label. That was absolutely it was as good as the ultra rare Beatles stuff, and and this particular one had the Memphis stuff on it, and I'm trying to remember the song. I can't remember the song now. There was one song in particular that he did over and over and over again. It was just really, really wonderful. But
a lot of that stuff is probably out officially now on the FTD series. If you're interested in that, they're out there. I'm just looking at. I have a bunch of Elvis playlists on my iTunes, and for the one of them is just the albums as they came out, and that playlist is 692 songs. So he sure did a lot of work. And then if you go to the FTD series, that is 4,267 songs. So that's, all the outtakes, all the extra live stuff, you name it. So there's tons of Elvis out there if you like it.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the Vegas stuff and everything, I mean, I find it sociologically fascinating, to listen to these concerts and think, this was in some ways for some audience a really big deal and a very, very polished stage show. To me, it's kind of actually a different Elvis than the Elvis of the stuff that I actually love.
Exactly.
But it's interesting. There's some good stuff. There's some not good stuff. It's very strange, the whole Elvis thing, I have to say. I understand what the stuff that Ken likes. Those are in a way the cream of the crop of that era for him. But
and to me, what matters is the records and his voice.
Yeah,
were just perfect for what he was doing.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't like Vegas-y stuff, then you just don't like that kind of style. But, his voice was something really magical. And so was Frank Sinatra, too. They were both tops in their fields.
Mm-hmm.
But when you've got a voice that appeals to so many different types of people, so many different genres of music, that is something really unique that we should treasure and really look up to. It's so rare to have an artist, like I said with Elvis. He was on the pop charts, the R&B charts, and the country charts. He had a gospel album. He could do just about anything vocally. And, his voice matched the music, and the arrangements of his songs were wonderful. So, with the Beatles, their influence was far beyond that. So, it wasn't just the singing, because a lot of people love the vocals of the Beatles. Mm-hmm. A lot of people think John was one of the greatest rock and roll voices, and Paul's got one of the greatest voices ever. So, the Beatles' influence goes into songwriting, it goes into production, it goes into the way that their careers were guided. Mm-hmm. The way that they went, the fact that they weren't a formula artist.
Exactly.
What Elvis became with his movies and with his music in the 60s in particular. Mm-hmm. So, I don't want to say one's better than the other. They were all the tops, in their fields. But Frank and Elvis had an edge over the Beatles in certain things, especially when it comes to acting, because the Beatles were never really actors. No. I think John probably, to me, had the most natural ability as an actor, personally, although I like a lot of Ringo's acting. A lot of it seems forced, and not natural. Mm-hmm. But Elvis and Frank were really good as actors, and they should be given credit for that. Mm-hmm. Elvis could be good as an actor if he was given the right role, like I said.
And by the way, also, because I did a piece on this in Beatle Fan some years ago. There's a pantheon of pop music phenomena. And we've been talking about Elvis and the Beatles and Frank Sinatra, but also you got to throw in Bing Crosby as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Bing Crosby, who was maybe, especially when you talk about somebody who was a multi-dimensional superstar, he was probably the most popular entertainer of the first half of the 20th century.
That's right. He doesn't get mentioned enough because Frank kind of overshadows him to a lot of people.
Well, only because of the fact that his career was so long ago. Because I mean, Crosby had ridiculous numbers of hit records in the 30s, but that's a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So and unfortunately, a lot of people don't remember that.
Mm-hmm.
And Frank really started in the 40s with big band.
39. I mean, his career spanned
Okay.
Just about 55 years, and Crosby's was only a little less than that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Elvis's career was 23 years, and the Beatles as a group was 7. But what a 7 years!
Right.
Yeah, and then again, as I like to point out, the Beatles also had success as solo artists more than any other band. So that's also something you have to take into account too.
Right. Oh yeah. Right. But they weren't the phenomena that they were as a group.
Culturally.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Okay. Musically, we can debate.
And we do weekly.
Right.
Yes.
That we do.
So, guys, that was a fun discussion about a number of things. Troppo, Elvis, Frank, the Fabs, of course. And that brings another episode of Things We Said Today to a close for this week. Folks out there, if you want to email us, our email address is thingswesaidtodayradioshow@gmail.com. We've been getting lots of great comments, which we'll undoubtedly devote part of a show to soon. Thanks for writing, and keep that up. Feel free to suggest things. On Twitter, we're at symbol Things We Said Fab.
Yay! He got it right.
All right. And in addition to the Things We Said Today stuff on the Twitter feed, Steve often puts his stories there, which are really must-reads. You got to keep up with that if you want to keep up with the Beatles. So until next week, for Ken Michaels, Al Sussman, and Steve Marinucci, I'm Alan Kozin, saying see you next time.